can we really be forgiving of some of the things going on now? Is that possible? How do you deal with um, uh, poor leadership, attacks on humanity? How do you handle the people perpetrating those things? Can you be forgiving?
I actually do believe that if one looks at the individuals and the acts that are happening from a place of compassion and love and understanding, um, then you might, for example, look at an individual and think, it must be really difficult to be that person, to have that feeling of potential hatred in your heart, or not to have your heart open to love. That must be very difficult. That said, I would not want to support that that action, that individual, and I would take action, not against the person, but to bring forth a situation that was more in alignment with my values. And I would work hard for that. And I would still hope there would be a teachable moment for individuals who are perpetuating and perpetrating some of these acts and situations. But I think the focus needs to be on what do we need to do to bring about the equity that that many of us feel like we need to have in this global society.
You are watching Profunda TV with host Phyllis Haynes.
And it's a pleasure to have you here. I've heard so much about your work and your extraordinary experience in global work. Please share with us how would you describe yourself?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's an interesting question. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate this. I would describe the work that I'm doing as a global peace leader. So the work is really incorporating components from leadership, components from coaching, components from peace building world, and really putting them together into a model that I'm hoping will be able to serve multiple genres, multiple sectors, multiple cultures, because it is based on an East-West approach. So it incorporates many tenets of Ubuntu, which is an African humanistic philosophy, which we can chat about now or a little bit later. But in general, I wanted something that was pan-applicable, that could really unite humanity at a time when we just so desperately need that to happen.
Have you been accused of tilting at windmills? I mean, is it really possible to conceive of global peace? Is it realistic?
I used to get that question a lot, and it's fascinating to me, but I think as a result of COVID and the pandemic, that people have reached a point where they have nothing left but hope. I think they have reached the deepest of despair, and it really experienced extraordinary circumstances that they probably never could have even imagined in their lifetime. And many have come to a place of, well, there is really nothing left but to hope for global unity, global humanity, recognizing the humanity in all of us, the interconnectedness, and what would naturally arise from that would be peace. I think if you go around still saying, oh, I'm trying to achieve global peace, you might get the naysayers. But if you talk about uniting humanity, then I think people can really get on board around that, and that lends itself to global peace.
The name of your organization is the Deeper Leadership Institute. How does leadership play into your vision, and what do you mean by deeper leadership?
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, I actually had many iterations for the organization's name. And I finally realized after working with many coaching clients, so I work with clients in corporate NGOs, et cetera, all over the world, that really everything emanates from one's own self-leadership. And we are starting to experience that now, for example, in MBA programs, but it's not something that we are raised up with, to use that term. And so people are thrown into situations where they need to lead others and realize they've never led themselves. And many people have just found themselves in situations they don't necessarily consciously choose situations. They just sort of, go with things, and then all of a sudden have a crisis. So Deeper Leadership Institute for me is about having self-leadership at the platform. It's the absolute base for all the work that we do. So it's self-awareness as the foundation. And then from there, self-mastery. And the self-mastery, then you can, once you have more of a sense of self, you can bring that sense of self to other people. So it's a relational awareness. Oh, how am I with other people? And then mastering that. Okay, I've not been so successful in situations with other people. How do I master that? Ultimately, a change then in attitudes and behaviors, which we believe will bring about an equitable and just world. So it took a long time to realize that the deeper component of leadership was really important and foundational to all the work that we do, because we have to show up with a full sense of knowing of ourselves.
So in talking and working with other people, what have been some of the obstacles you've experienced? Have you traveled to many unusual places?
I actually have. I used to live in Asia. I've traveled all over most of the world. I do a lot of work in India, for example. The obstacles tend to be when you're in a culture or a personal culture, either one. So it could be a geographic culture or your own culture that tends to be very head-oriented, so very analytical, prizes that type of thing. So for example, STEM folks, science, technology, engineering, and math, and cultures within India that prize that deep analytical thinking, that tends to be an obstacle to becoming a little bit more self-aware, because you haven't been trained to use, any heart-centered focus, but also you haven't been rewarded for it either. So that has proven to be a bit of an obstacle for folks, but that's an area that I love to work with.
Well, what about gender? I mean, I've worked with some technological folks, mostly males, in the beginning of my work in this field. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of resistance to gender, and some of the stuff that you're describing may be gender-based. Women tend to have a more heart focus. I don't mean to generalize. I've met some pretty tough women, but is there a gender problem or a gap when you're trying to work with such folks?
Well, I've been coaching since the early 2000s. So I will say that at the beginning, I would 100% you could see that gap very clearly. Now there are more and more women in the STEM fields, but I will say that because they tend to gravitate toward that field because they are more analytical and those are their skill sets, and that's their natural personality, that they do share some of the obstacles to a more heart-centered approach, more of a self-awareness situation. So it has been interesting to, IT is still very much dominated by men. And at the same time, the women who come into that, there's an expectation that they might be more heart-centered. They might be more of a feeling on the Myers-Briggs, but they're not. And so then the additional issue there is that they are fighting a stereotype of who people think they are based on their gender, but that's not their personality type.
So what does Ubuntu mean in terms of your work now? What is Ubuntu?
So Ubuntu is, as I mentioned, an African humanistic philosophy. What it really means is I am who I am because of who you are. So it means I cannot exist as a human without you. And that's still a little esoteric for most people. So I usually share a little bit of the story that Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu utilized this concept to unite South Africa post-apartheid. And they did that by pulling some of the tenets of Ubuntu. And at that time, I think Ubuntu was fairly familiar to most people in South Africa, not so much outside of South Africa. But some of the tenets were compassion. You've also heard the Dalai Lama speak about this. Some of the other tenets, well, major tenet would be interconnectedness. So for example, if I hurt you in some way, I am hurting myself and I'm hurting you. I'm also hurting the people that are connected to me, to my side, to behind me, as well as the people that are connected to you, to your side and behind you. And so the idea is that we are so deeply interconnected as humans that we need to recognize that and elevate each other through compassion and forgiveness. And now Mandela used this in terms of forgiving others. I start with forgiving self. Very important to forgive self and to apply a lot of these tenets to ourselves and then apply them to others. So the idea is really that everyone is doing their best at all times, and that sounds a little Pollyanna-ish, but if that's your viewpoint, then you will often get that back to you. It's a beautiful space to hold energetically. That I just believe the positive in you, and at the same time, I'll use the process of discernment. So I'm not going to engage you deeply. If you have a lot more to learn in certain areas, but I'm also not going to harm you, and I'm not going to speak ill of you. I'm just going to send as much love as I can to you, but I will manage the process of discernment. So for me, that's how I apply Ubuntu, and that's how it was applied early on in South Africa, which is how I discovered it on a trip there doing some research in the early 2000s. I had never heard of it before. And all of a sudden, when I heard that Mandela said, Ubuntu will be the gift that we give to the world, that South Africa will give to the world, I was like, yes, yes, it will. And how can I be a part of that? Because I want to disseminate this. And so while I was in South Africa, a model of leadership kind of came to me. You may know how that happens in terms of inspiration. And I thought, all right, I can use this model and bring this to leadership work. And that was the initial stage of how I introduced it. And then it morphed into more peace leadership. And it's a slightly different model now, but the tenets of Ubuntu, especially around interconnectedness, are very much present.
Okay, so this is a political free zone because I do a regular program on Profunda TV, and we look for possibilities. We look for ways, solutions, innovative ways to solve problems. Yet, based on what you've just said, without discussing the political obvious issue, can we really be forgiving of some of the things going on now? Is that possible? How do you deal with uh, poor leadership, attacks on humanity. How do you handle the people perpetrating those things? Can you be forgiving?
So I can speak from my, I would say, a personal perspective, because I don't think everyone can do this at this point in time, because I think it's so personal, and and people are so they're triggered by what's happening, to be honest with you, which is where that self-awareness piece comes in. I actually do believe that if one looks at the individuals and the acts that are happening from a place of compassion and love, and understanding, then you might, for example, look at an individual and think, it must be really difficult to be that person, to have that feeling of potential hatred in your heart, or not to have your heart open to love. That must be very difficult. That said, I would not want to support that that action, that individual, and I would take action, not against the person, but to bring forth a situation that was more in alignment with my values, and I would work hard for that. And I would still hope there would be a teachable moment for individuals who are perpetuating and perpetrating some of these acts and situations. But I think the focus needs to be on, what do we need to do to bring about the equity that we, that many of us feel like we need to have in this global society. So I'm not even speaking about the United States here. It's really, I think the masses can truly use their voices. I think they are fed up. I think they are truly seeing that we've experienced for many decades, so not recent history, smoke and mirrors. And they're waking up. They're waking up to this and understanding and realizing their own power. So in many situations, I feel like we're back to that fundamental level of self-awareness. But I think from that place, if we don't forgive persons or situations, then we really do stay in prison. And I think Mandela said that. We imprison ourselves to continue that. And that's not what we want to do. We really want to break free of this energy of the situation of people behaving in this way. And I think the only way to do that is to forgive ourselves for not acting, perhaps when we could have and should have, and forgive others and feel compassion towards them.
Yeah, when you're speaking, I think of the extraordinary applications of Ubuntu in Africa, where there have been healing, and Rwanda, for example, is what comes to mind, where people in many cases, have forgiven each other for the atrocities that occurred. Have you the same kind of witnessing or experience in your mind?
Yes, both on a personal level and then within communities. I think once people, and I've seen this mostly in the diversity work, so people who are, for lack of a better term, racist, unaware they were racist, and then they hear firsthand an account from someone who's African American about what they have experienced, then I think they can begin to heal themselves. And they do that by forgiving themselves and then forgiving what may have happened to them directly or even indirectly in terms of community violence. So I have seen that, but what it takes is people really seeing someone from another perspective, and they have to almost crack themselves open. They have to get to that raw, vulnerable place of being able to see someone in a different light and then see themselves in a different light. And when that happens, it's pure beauty and pure magic. Because we've all, truthfully, I will say we've all, because I think, there's a place in education for changing all of this, but we've been really raised with systemic racism. And I think it's important to change that. And we've grown up, many of us, unaware of what we have been taught on different levels.
In looking at your website, there are lots of charts, but there's a pyramid. Can you discuss the particular pyramid? It's not Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
What is your pyramid?
Okay. Well, it actually, there's a little precursor diagram to that. So essentially, the pyramid you're speaking of was the model that kind of came to me in South Africa. And I'll discuss that in just a second. What came to me afterwards was that model was really a model for global citizenship, and that it was really the intersection of two circles. And the two circles are positive leadership and positive peace. And when those two intersect, that point of intersection is what I call peace leadership. And that is the diagram that you're referring to. And so peace leadership for me is taking components of positive leadership, components of positive peace, putting them together into this model. And the model has at the foundation self-awareness. And then, as I had mentioned, you go up this pyramid, but it is not, it's not a stage model. So as you go up the pyramid, you could bounce right back down into self-awareness. So for example, I start at self-awareness, I'm moving up into self-mastery. As I'm practicing self-mastery, I have a situation that happens, a teachable moment, and I have another moment of self-awareness. So I kind of bounce back into self-awareness for a little while around that issue. And then I go back up into self-mastery, and then relational awareness. And again, as I'm having an awareness about who I am, what my impact is on others that I may not have had any idea about, I go back into self-awareness, and then maybe back to relational awareness and relational mastery. So the idea is that you're building, but that it's fluid. And then ultimately, once we have, we never stop growing, but once we have a pretty good sense of self-awareness and how we are with other people, and then we are really exploring our attitudes, our behaviors, all of those things, put them all together, then ultimately, if you believe that people want good and are good, you would have a just and equitable society. And that would result in human flourishing, would be the ultimate goal. What's infused around that triangle, so there are arrows pointing into each of those levels that I just discussed, the self-awareness, self-mastery, relational awareness, relational mastery, are all the tenets of Ubuntu. So compassion is infused into each level, interconnectedness, dignity, treating ourselves and others with dignity. So at every stage, those tenets of Ubuntu are infused in as a way of being, essentially. And then on the sides of the pyramid, there are sectors, and they're deliberately left a little loose: economic, social, and environment, because people might put political under social, they might put it in other places. I don't have a horse in that race in terms of where those particular things fall. I just wanted to be able to have this applicable to all sectors and cultures. And so that's really the diagram. It's really, I hope, a model for global citizenship to result in human flourishing.
Thank you very much. I really am looking forward to more conversation with you and collaboration with you. We are talking with Dr. Dinan. She is the CEO of the Deeper Leadership Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phyllis.